Welcome to the Relevance Report, where we explore the relevant stories that are shaping our world today. I'm Sydney Peach, your host this week. On today's show, we'll hear about one person's experience with Black History Month. Then, we'll talk about the cost of living for young adults in Canada. We'll talk about climate change and hear from an expert on ice loss in the Arctic and the crisis at hand. Then, some valuable insights in business management and Edmonton's growing electronic music scene and the makings of a professional DJ. Local Edmonton creative Geli Kabuki is involved in many organizations and events that celebrate Black excellence. Gelika shares his experience as a Black man and what Black History Month means to him. I spoke with him about the importance for all people to educate themselves and get involved in celebrating Black excellence.
Hi, my name is Geli Kabuki. I am half Congolese and half Rwandese, and I came to Canada at the age of 4. We lived in Hamilton for 2 to 3 years, and I've been in Edmonton ever since.
So what does Black History Month mean to you?
For me, Black History Month is a celebration of the adversity, the triumphs, and the sacrifices that Black people had to do, not only in the States, but also in Canada. And it's, personally for me, it's also a celebration of just like Black excellence, Black joy, and just what it is to be Black and the variety, I guess, of what that means. And I think it's important to celebrate the joys and not only the sufferings that Black people have had to endure. So I try to focus on the excellence, the things that we've been able to overcome, and just the joy and the laughter, and just being Black is pretty great.
How do you celebrate Black History Month?
Personally, I celebrate Black History Month by continuing to educate myself about the roles that Black people have had throughout history. I also partake in a few of the events that happen in the city of Edmonton, such as like 5 Artists, 1 Love. And I also try to continue to support Black artists, Black businesses, and just honestly anything, I guess, Black. And then on top of that, I would say that I'm decently involved in the community. I just like to celebrate Black History Month and also like to celebrate it in other months outside of Black History Month.
Why do you think Black History Month is important for the Black community?
I think it's important because it's a time of celebration, a time of reflection, and a time to be given the recognition that we deserve through these events or through these awards or even grants that are given, I would say sometimes specifically for Black History Month. And although that is important for the Black community and additional things that are very personal to each Black individual that celebrates Black History Month, but I think that during this time, it's also important for white people and non-Black people to educate themselves, and especially in the age of information, that there are resources out there, especially after the Black Lives Matter protests in Edmonton and across the world. I think it's important that each and every one of those people educate themselves and not use Black people as like their Google, because that is quite traumatic to be asked all these questions and almost represent the entire Black community. We all have different walks of life. We've all been through different experiences, and they're all valid. So I think not only is it important for Black people to celebrate Black History Month, but it's also important for non-Black people to celebrate and also be a part of the solution, as everyone has a role in equality and equity.
What has your experience been like as a Black man in Canada?
My experience has been interesting. I think growing up, I was very ignorant to racism in a way, just because I thought that some of my friends or even the people around me didn't have internalized racism. But I think as I grew up, I started to see that it's very subtle, especially in Canada, whether it's the way people look at you or will almost discriminate you or even put you kind of in a corner. Or even sometimes I have this fear that when I am working on a project or even hired for something, that it's not based off of like my accomplishments and what I'm able to bring to the team, but more just for like the diversity hire. So these are things that as a Black man, I'm consistently thinking about. And like I said, with just everything being subtle, sometimes some of my previous relationships, were they just interested in me, or was it due to the fact that being with a Black man has some privileges, quote unquote? So yeah, it's been interesting, and I think there's still a lot of work to be done before I would say, I don't know, if I were to have kids, to be like, yeah, you will be loved and looked at justly and won't be discriminated or looked down upon just because you're a Black person.
Who has been an inspiration in your life?
My inspiration in my life has been my dad. Coming to Canada with 2 young kids, not knowing the language or how to operate the system, coming from being a pharmacist back in Congo and just having a good career, quite accomplished, and having to give that all up to keep his family safe and give them a better future. Fast forward, he is now 80 years old. He's still working, making sure he's able to provide for his kids, has put us through school, post-secondary, and continued to push us to be the best that we can be. And to see him just maneuver all that, and also where he currently works, people kind of disregard him and put him down due to the fact that his English is broken. However, he speaks over 5 languages, a brilliant man who was able to make something of himself, almost the worst conditions, to come to a new country, a new continent, and make something of himself to the best of his abilities while having 2 kids to take care of, and now 8 kids, as we went from 2 to 8 kids. So yeah, just seeing his positivity in life, his resilience, his tenacity, and his ability to just always put his, the right foot forward and having a positive outlook on life regardless of the circumstances. And those are some qualities that I truly admire.
The cost of living as a Canadian right now is more than a bit unbalanced, especially for young people. This is something a lot of Canadians can relate to as we enter yet another pricey year. In this brief sit-down, we'll be hearing from Katie Evans as she interviews fellow Edmontonian Alyssa Wagler, who talks about managing rent, work, and a social life in her early 20s.
As someone who rents here in Edmonton, do you feel that your cost of rent is proportional to what you get in terms of amenities, services, and the overall quality of living here?
Yeah, only because where I'm living, I only pay for a 2-bedroom. It's just over $1,100. Heat is included, same with water, and then we have to pay for power and then Wi-Fi ourselves. So I think that that's fair, opposed to trying to move out and move somewhere else. It's really hard because everything is closer to $1,700 for a 2-bedroom. Then you get your gym included and all. I just want the basic living costs because things are expensive. So
has your rent increased at all since you first moved in here?
Not really. I moved in 2 years ago and it stayed the same. I just now have to pay for parking, which is $50 a month.
Do you feel financially stable currently as a full-time worker paying rent?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It is really hard to keep myself afloat because I'm making about maybe a little bit more than a minimum wage, and it is still really hard to make ends meet. I have no savings. I'm not going to be able to save until I start either making more money or getting a second job. So no, absolutely not. I don't feel stable.
So what are your plans, your future housing, living situation? Do you want to eventually have a house, or do you have a finance plan in place?
No finance plan in place. I try to stick to a budget a little bit, but it's hard when I want to go and do fun things with my friends and buy nice things or go thrifting and all this stuff. But it's really hard to keep on track for that. And then living in a house of my own, I'd love to, but it just doesn't seem realistic for myself as a single person moving into a house. Unless someone left me a huge lump sum of money, then yes. But that's the only way I can see it happening.
Do you have any advice for other people who are young in their early 20s when it comes to living on your own? People are starting to kind of move out of their parents' basement at this age and kind of start that independent lifestyle. Do you have any advice about kind of branching into that chapter of your life?
My best advice would be just to make sure that you're saving enough money. I wish that when I moved out, my dad was telling me just put aside what you'd pay for rent into a savings account, and then that'll grow, and then by the time you move out, you might even have enough to buy a house. And even if you buy a 2-bedroom, you can rent out the other room, and then your mortgage is covered. But even if you don't decide to go that way, then you have all this money saved up for furniture or rent, and then also you can kind of gauge if you could even afford to move out at that point. If you're putting $600, $500 into a savings account every single month, then you know that you can. Unless you're if you're dipping into it, then you probably want to save up a little bit more money or get a different job or ask for a raise.
Have you thought about getting a second job, or have you thought about some sort of backup plan if it really comes to that point?
Yeah, definitely looked into getting a second job, but that's also hard because not a lot of people are hiring, especially in January, February, beginning of the year. It's the worst time to look for a job, I find. And then also it kind of sacrifices your social life too. So if I'm working full time from 10 to 6, which is my usual hours, then I'm going to have to work like 3 hours at minimum at the end of my shift. And you need to have 15 hours a week available even. So it makes things hard for sure. Every single time that my parents have bottles, I will just be like, hey, can I take your bottles in? Because I have no money.
Since you've been living here, you've always had a roommate, right?
Yes.
And do you think like you would be able to continue living here if you didn't have a roommate to like split that cost of rent?
I'd be able to, but if my friends would ask me to go out, I would say that I couldn't. Or I'd be like, I'll just have the water, please. And that's what it would be. Like, I could, but it would be even harder than it is now.
What's your like 5-year goal when it comes to like your living situation?
So I definitely want to be in a place that has in-suite laundry, because currently I don't. And I just find it gross, like kind of sharing a laundry machine with 12 other units. I want underground parking, like just being more independent too. And I definitely want to live on my own, or if I'm with a partner at the time, maybe live with them. But yeah, definitely stay in Edmonton. But it seems that there's no other choice, since this is the cheapest that it's probably going to get in Alberta or even Canada.
Exploring what it takes to manage a successful business with Shauna Lowinger, who's an expert in successful business management, and will touch on the key factors with Keegan Purcell.
So, can you briefly introduce yourself and provide an overview of your experience as being a general manager in the golf course industry?
My name's Shauna Lowinger. Okay, so I've been working in the golf industry for 15 years. I've been the food and beverage and events manager at 2 different golf courses over my tenure. Started off, I moved to Kimberley 15 years ago. I've got my degree in management from U of A. When I moved to Kimberley, couldn't really find a job down there that fit my degree, so I got into the golf industry just by knowing somebody. Within a month or so of working in it, fell in love with food and beverage, fell in love with events, and it grew from there. Didn't really have experience getting into it. It was kind of all learn as I went. And the more that I worked in the industry, the more I fell in love with it, the better I got at things. Took some different classes, learning event organization. And then food and beverage was just kind of like one of those things where you've gone out to restaurants, you've eaten, and you kind of know what you expect when you're a customer. So it kind of gave me the experience to know what to do as the food and beverage manager.
Awesome. And how do you approach things like strategic management in a golf course setting? Are there any notable successful initiatives that you've had?
The best thing is communication. Communicate with your staff, communicate with your customers, communicate with just everybody. Communication is the best strategic approach. The more you talk to people, the more you get to know what works, what doesn't work, what's going to make your day easier, what's going to make it better for your staff, what's going to make the overall experience more enjoyable for your guests. Communication is number one.
How do you prioritize and enhance customer relations in the golf course business?
Biggest thing would be making sure that your staff is trained, that your staff are happy. My whole theory is if my staff are happy, they enjoy coming to work, they're going to produce a more, I guess you could say, like pleasant environment for not just themselves, but for the guests. The better that staff communicate with each other and work together, that's going to roll down into the guest experience. Just, making sure everyone is happy and looked after.
How do you foster that kind of positive work environment for your team? Are there any specific challenges that you've faced?
Again, that's where communication comes into, checking in with your staff to make sure that, they don't have any issues. When an issue does arrive, trying to sit down and working out, I don't want to say, I guess, like the most pleasant outcome, but just making sure that every side is happy, that the issue got resolved. There's always going to be conflict. People don't always get along. We're all different personalities. We're all different people. So, but again, this is where communication is going to come into, just making sure to check in with people all the time. Don't just think just because they showed up to work that they're happy and all is good. Talking to people, letting them know when they've done a good job, letting them know when they've got things to work on. It just comes down to communication again.
What role do the kind of public relations you have with customers and there any successful campaigns you can highlight?
We don't really do a whole lot of advertising because it is golf, so people come and do it. The best thing, again, is talking to your people. A lot of the events that we do get at the golf course, I get because of word of mouth. So it might have been like an event I already did, and they saw the productivity of the event. They saw how well the event was executed, how the staff and myself were there, making sure that, wants and needs were looked after. Word of mouth is definitely our biggest one. Giving everybody the overall experience that they're looking for. You're paying a lot of money to come out to either play golf, to say host a tournament, host an event. So making sure that people are looked after and their expectations are met gives good a word of mouth, which is going to bring in more business.
How do you deal with the community engagement?
That one's kind of tough because people think because they live on the golf course, they're a little bit, I don't want to say privileged, but we're supposed to look after them a little bit more. Again, it's the biggest thing is if they have a complaint or if they have something that needs to be addressed, listening to what they have to say. Can't always solve the problem, can't always fix it, but just definitely listening to them. And then it's always nice too, we try to have a forum once a year and invite our neighbors to come in and sit and say, okay, this is the golf season ahead. These are some of the things that we're looking at. We might have this many tournaments. We have this going on, that going on, just to kind of give them a heads up. That's the best thing that we can do. But at the end of the day, they still might get a little upset because, a golfer, peed against their back fence or a golf ball came into their backyard. These are all things that we can't control, but the best that we can communicate with them and give them a heads up of what's going on. It's the best way to deal with our neighbors.
Next up, Dr. Robin Wojwitka speaks about the rising crisis on Arctic ice loss and its effects on crops. Dr. Wojwitka has experience in ice patch research, and without preventative actions being taken, the global climate crisis will only worsen. According to the journal Science Direct, a nearly ice-free summer Arctic Ocean is predicted by the mid-2030s. Jada Radica spoke to Dr. Wojwitka on what he has to say.
I'm Robin Wojwitka, and I'm an assistant professor in Earth Sciences in the Physical Sciences Department at MacEwan University.
Would you be willing to explain your field of work and areas of expertise?
I focus on past environmental changes and reconstructing them from different proxies. I look at ice patches, which we can get the isotope chemistry from, and we can radiocarbon date those, how the ice chemistry changed, and then how the different plants and animal communities changed through time.
How would you explain the relationship between Arctic ice loss and weather patterns?
The Arctic is a very important part of the climate system. It's at an extreme latitude, which increases its sensitivities to changes, inputs of radiation or heat energy to the planet. When we have an increase of energy to the planet, we will get increases in temperature. When we have the Earth farther away, we have decreases in temperature. Those are natural rhythms. The Earth will absorb energy and keep it for a little while before it re-emits it. And that storage is governed by how much greenhouse gases are in the atmosphere. In the Arctic, we can often have CO2 held in sediments and sea ice, permafrost. We're sequestering CO2 so that there's less in the atmosphere and things get cooler, or it offsets heating.
Can you explain any potential effects on Arctic ecosystems due to ice loss?
I can speak about permafrost loss. This is ice that grows in the pore spaces in soil, the spaces between grains or rocks and soil. Most of the Canadian North is in the continuous permafrost zone, which means that after a certain depth, the ground is frozen. Part of the things that are frozen in there is organic material. And this stuff will get incorporated into the soil and then frozen, sometimes for tens or hundreds of thousands of years. When you start to melt that carbon gets released very quickly into the atmosphere. If that were to thaw under natural conditions, it would take tens to hundreds of thousands of years. But we're thawing permafrost at a rate that is much, much higher than natural rhythms. We're pumping more greenhouse gas into the atmosphere, which then means that we heat up more. It's called a positive feedback loop, and it's really hard to reverse those.
How does the change in weather patterns impact agricultural practices?
The Earth's atmosphere is connected all the way around the world. So when you perturb one part of it, there's a cascade effect. When the atmospheric exchange changes in, say, the Arctic, or if it changes in the mid-latitudes, the whole system alters. One thing that we're seeing is drier summers and then more extreme weather events. Basically what that on a very high level is indicative of is instability in the atmospheric system. It's way more unpredictable because it is adjusting to this new influx of greenhouse gases at a rate that the system isn't used to. And that can lead to droughts. We're seeing this in the American Southwest and through the Great Plains. The prairies are now getting water earlier than usual, which causes farming issues because we're used to the big melt coming right around when we seed our crops. But now it's coming way earlier, which means all the water is passed through the system for Alberta and gone to Hudson Bay by the time the farmers really need it. And sometimes people say, well, we should do more irrigation, but that is just pushing the problem down the road because irrigation brings its own issues.
Are there specific regions that are more susceptible to the consequences of ice loss?
The communities that are at the largest risk are northern communities, especially ones that are built on permafrost. And we're seeing that throughout northern Canada in Indigenous communities. Also, with sea ice loss, communities are losing a primary resource that they rely on for food and other subsistence materials. Navigating the ice is harder. The animals are moving into different places that are inaccessible. It's a very concerning situation, and it's happening now. It's not a thing of the future. It's now.
Do you think we can take any preventative measures to minimize the loss of crops?
It's never too late. This is a huge issue. We've kind of let off a bomb. You can't put it back together. But what we can do is limit the damage through the future. And the only way that that will ever happen is through the political will of the international community.
Lastly today, a deep dive into the new generation of raving post-pandemic. Resident DJ at Y After Hours, Joe Dennehy, aka Dadman, talks about what it takes to get your time in the spotlight. Satch spoke with him to understand how it doesn't just boil down to how you act on stage.
My DJ name is Dadman. I've been playing professionally for about 7 years now, and probably about 3 years maybe worth of practicing in my basement before that.
And how have you seen the rave scene change since the end of the pandemic?
I would say that in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, it was very, very dead. A lot of people, I think, were afraid still to go out and be in public. And it took a long time for them to get over that fear and start going out and being sociable again. So there was a lot of venues that were struggling crazily, venues that closed. Since the pandemic, there was huge companies that used to do shows every single weekend at sometimes multiple venues. And companies like Blueprint and Boudang were just doing so many shows with huge artists every single weekend. And then they just didn't come back at first. Now I would say things are more or less back to normal, where it's becoming easier and easier to sell out shows. Clubs are packed full of people every single weekend. Venues that had stayed closed for a long time, even after the pandemic, like the Y After Hours, are open again. So I think it's sort of back to normal now, although I think the underground thrived to a certain extent. During the pandemic and even after the pandemic, some of the more underground groups are doing better too.
And say last week I went to my first show, fell in love with DJing, and wanted to go for it, try it myself. Where would I even start?
The very first step to becoming a DJ is to be a music lover, and a passionate music lover and collector of music. If you don't have a collection of music to draw upon, you can't play. You need to get out there on the internet and start digging for good music and collect it up, download it, get it onto your computer, install the software that we use to organize our collections, analyze them, and export them onto USBs for playing, and get yourself a controller and start practicing.
What advice would you give to young aspiring DJs?
I would say that you are going to need to go to shows and meet people. Your relationships determine whether or not you get booked. So if you make friends with the organizers,
promoters, people running promo teams, venue owners. When you've developed those relationships, you will get booked. Offer to promote for any of the local production companies, promotion companies. Make yourself useful. Help them grow their business so that they see value in having you come.
What are some of the most important factors in going professional?
I would say song selection is a huge part of it. 80% of the battle, you can't just play the same music that people hear on the radio. You need to find those masterpieces that people have not heard before. The other 10% is maybe technical and mixing ability, and the last 10% is stage presence, where to some extent you need to sell the audience on the music that you love, and you have to express how much you love it with your body language, with dancing, singing if you can sing along. The more you express how much you love it, the more infectious that is, and then the audience will resonate with that and love what you do. In terms of becoming a professional or being a professional, that professionalism doesn't end when you get off the stage, that how you conduct yourself in your personal life matters, and that the rave community is a relatively small community, and if you're misbehaving in your personal relationships, if you're not behaving well online, people will notice that. That professionalism goes way beyond just what you're doing on stage. People get to know who you are to a certain extent, so be on your best behavior, I guess, when you're on the stage or off.
Thanks for joining us for the Relevance Report. This week's episode was produced by Katie Evans, Keegan Purcell, Sach Petrov, Jada Radica, and myself, Sydney Peach. The show was edited by Sach Petrov. The show's supervising producer is Sheena Rossiter. Additional studio supervision by Sasha Stanoivich. This podcast is produced as part of the BCSC 325 Radio News and Documentaries course in the winter 2024 semester. This course is part of the Bachelor of Communication Studies program in the Department of Communication at MacEwan University. The show was edited and produced out of the MacEwan Media Production Studio. Our theme music is called Buzzing by Kaylee Lambert. Additional thanks to Alexander Stepanov, Envir Avatian, and Alexi Kristilin from Pixie Bay for their royalty-free tunes in this episode. Logo design for this podcast is by Sasha Stanoivich. And I'm Sydney Peach, your host for this week's episode. This podcast was recorded on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional and ancestral territory of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, and Nakota Sioux. We acknowledge that this territory is home to the Métis settlements and the Métis Nation of Alberta, Regions 2, 3, and 4, within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. Don't forget to subscribe to the Relevance Report on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what you heard, please leave us a review and a rating. It really helps people find the show. Please join us again next week when we report the relevant stories that are shaping our worlds.